Right, good afternoon. This is the hearings on CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And we're sitting here at the University of New South Wales. Together with me are Dr. Helen Pringle, Mary Kerr, Kerry Heubel, and Bashi Kumar should be with us, but unfortunately has caught flu from her young children who are kindergarten age, and all the women out there who are mothers will understand why that's the case. This morning we heard from Leonie Maguire, who spoke about the Taree Women's Refuge and the program they had, which is no more, and her recommendations for the future. Dr. Michelle Fernando from Adelaide, speaking on the family court and her recommendations for the future, and Barbary Clark on women and disability, speaking about the impact of polio, which was a disease she suffered as a child and which is recurring now in her adult age and her older age. And right now we have Sally Gearin, who is a barrister from the Northern Territory. So please go ahead, Sally. You provided us with a witness statement and here you are to present. Thank you.
Thank you, members of the board, and indeed, Dr. Scutt. I've always known you as a fearless advocate for women. And in fact, in my statement, I've referred to your book, which made a significant difference in my life, which was titled Even in the Best of Homes. I wanted to raise with CEDAW what I consider is one of Australia's best kept secrets in terms of Aboriginal women. I've lived up here, in my statement you'll see, since 1986, and even though I didn't do crime, for various reasons, I went out to community and saw what was happening there. I was basically a personal injury barrister. That's what I did here. I retired in 2010 and I have been sitting on various boards and tribunals since then, and I'm currently a part-time member of NTCAT. Civil lawyer, not a criminal lawyer, but as I have referred to in my statement, the most compelling evidence that we have in the Northern Territory is that certainly since 2008 and possibly before that, 70 to 80% of people in the adult jails in the Northern Territory are Aboriginal men who are there for alcohol-fuelled family violence. The other issue which is hidden, which is all of the Aboriginal women who do not report it, make a statement, and they do that for various reasons, one of which is fear of retribution. The second is their likelihood of losing their children if they leave, and so on. I've referred to some instances in my statement, but it is of great concern and nobody speaks out. In particular, Aboriginal women in power do not speak out against Aboriginal men who are the perpetrators of almost all of this violence. We do not have the data from the health department, which should be collated in the Northern Territory, both because there are clinics on country, and then if the matter is very serious, the women are brought into Alice Springs or into Darwin Hospital. All that data's there. Now, the fact that women do not then make a complaint to the police and proceedings, etc., is massive, because the consequences for women speaking out are such that they that they are not allowed to. They're silenced. They're silenced by their culture, which does not allow them to speak out. If they do, they will be sent out of their community and they will lose their children and their life. Where are they going to live? I mean, these people have lived on country all their life. It's not like they can just go and move to Sydney. You know, those things just, you know, it doesn't work like that. There is nowhere for them to go, and that's why they don't make a complaint, and they put up with it. And you know, the matter that occurred just recently is just another example, and that was a town matter. That was not a matter on community.
Could you clarify what that matter was, Sally?
Yes, yes. That was a matter that occurred recently on the 15th of April 2023. The Minister for Aboriginal Affairs was in Darwin, which was not advertised. Well, I certainly wasn't aware of it. And there was a domestic violence incident near the hotel she was staying at. She was stabbed almost to death. She staggered into the foyer of the hotel and was attended to by Minister Burney's staff. I'm not sure if she died there or died subsequently in the hospital. But
sorry, Sally, to interrupt, but can we just clarify? Linda Burney was in the hotel and yes. Linda Burney staff, but it was a woman who was a Darwin woman who came into the hotel. Just, we need to be clear because it was a bit ambiguous. Sorry.
I'm sorry, yes. I'm not sure if she was visiting town or whether she actually lives in Darwin. I would not know that information. Again, you've got to understand that people come into town and leave town for all kinds of reasons. They come in for medical issues or for legal issues or stuff to do with land rights. There's a big people moving in and out. This particular woman, I don't really know where she came from. I don't think any information was even provided in the media. I only know what I read in the media. But the bottom line is she went in there, stabbed to death, and the minister was there, came down from her room and saw the state of this woman. Now, the only reports were that she was killed by the perpetrator. They did not say it was an Aboriginal man, and they never say in relation to this violence that it was perpetrated by an Aboriginal man. This gives Aboriginal men enormous protection because they are not singled out. And as I've said in my statement, this is no different to what things were like in Sydney when I lived there, and Jocelynne was there leading the battle, that, you know, it was a hidden thing. Women did not complain. They were not allowed to complain. There was no support. There were no refuges. And if you did, you broke up your family. In fact, it was considered, you know, there was something the matter with you, that you couldn't keep your husband happy. That was the attitude in those days. I do remember there was a whole lot of rapes going on in Glebe at one stage there, and the Commissioner of Police in New South Wales said that women should not go out after 6 o'clock. And Jocelynne actually came into the media and said, well, the problem is not with women, the problem is men. The curfew should be on men. And that was the kind of thinking that we had then. But as I've said in my statement, this is the hidden problem. There is no data from the hospitals, but the fact that 70 to 80% on any given day or month of the year that Aboriginal men are, that's the percentage of them in jail for alcohol-fueled family violence. Now, if that indicator doesn't terrify people, it should. And as I have also said, and I'm repeating myself a bit here, but it's important, we do not have the data from the health departments in relation to women who come seeking assistance and say nothing. I mean, if I can refer to that article that I called One Circuit Sal, that I have attached to my statement, that's an article I wrote in 2008 when I went out to Nhulunbuy. They brought in a new a bit of the legislation which made mandatory a breach that if you were on a DV order, then what would happen was, and you breached it, you would then go back to jail. I went out to Nhulunbuy and actually acted for the very first woman who had been charged, and it was unusual for me to be doing something like that because, as I say, I didn't do crime. But in that situation, what I saw just terrified me. My client was threatened. We had to find a safe place for her before she gave evidence. She was threatened by his family. And this is an articulate Aboriginal woman who had actually been to boarding school here in Darwin, so she could actually speak English and her own language as well. A lot of these women cannot do that. But if I can just quote from that matter, one of the women who'd been brutally bashed for many years came to the police station the night before the hearing seeking to drop the charges, which is quite typical. The pressure had been brought on her by the perpetrator's relatives in town. We were able to talk her out of it and arrange for her to be taken to a safe family community 2 hours drive out of town after the hearing and conviction of the perpetrator. The logistics of keeping Aboriginal women safe in the bush are mind-boggling. Often women and children are kept prisoners at outstations. They have no transport, are hundreds of miles from services and safety. Some of these communities are only 50 or 100 people. When they finally escape and have the courage to seek assistance, they are usually alienated from family, country, and terrified of further attacks from the perpetrator and or his family, and not only on the victim, but on any of her family as well. Many of these women have been beaten and burnt with sticks, raped in front of their children, and physically and emotionally degraded in other sickening ways. Often there is insufficient evidence to sustain a criminal conviction because people do not come forward to give evidence. And Judith Kelly talks about that in the other article that I have that I've attached, which I won't take you to now, but that is also very important. Justice Kelly talks about matters that have actually come before her in the Supreme Court, and I really recommend that you read that article. The police in the Northern Territory try to do a wonderful job in difficult circumstances, and the AGPOs, the Aboriginal police officers, which is another class, I don't even know if they've got them anymore, are slowly turning around the culture of despair by making it easier for women to report. But of course, one of the other problems is that if you are involved in helping a woman in the community, you are then liable yourself, which is why you need independent people in the communities who are not going to be swayed by their own so-called family obligations. So the police, as in all domestic violence things, are the answer. But in my statement, I have referred to what I consider needs to happen. And that is in paragraph 9, when you asked me what recommendations I should make. I think we have to have people calling out Aboriginal men, because Aboriginal men will be the answer ultimately, as they were in our culture, to change things. White men have changed their culture. From when I grew up in the 1950s, my grandson, who's 25, there is no way he would even consider hitting a woman. It's just not part of his culture. And I'm not saying that men don't bash women in our culture as well, in our white culture, but it is no longer culturally acceptable in the way it was when Jocelynne led the way to change things, certainly in Sydney. But that has not occurred in Aboriginal culture. That change has not occurred. It's like something out of the Middle Ages. It's unbelievable. And there is plenty of talk about stopping incarceration of Aboriginal people. But in fact, most of the people who are incarcerated are there for family violence. So I think you've got to weigh all that up and we've got to find a way for these women to have a voice. And the very first place you need to start is with Aboriginal women politicians starting to call out the violence by their Aboriginal men. And as a white woman, it's always very difficult to speak up on these things, but because no one else is, that's why I am. So they're essentially my submissions. If you read my paper and the annexures, there's the evidence that I rely on in making this submission.
Thanks so much, Sally. Back, I think it was in the 1980s, Dr. Diana Bell and Topsy Naparella Nelson wrote an article about this, and Diana Bell was criticised because it was alleged that she had written the article and she'd somehow inveigled Topsy Naparella Nelson into collaborating with her. Well, of course, that was putting down Topsy Naparella Nelson, who was certainly a very strong woman with her own views and her own ideas. So the issue does come around and around. But we've got with us, Mary Kerr is actually in the Northern Territory Police, and we're fortunate to have her with us in Sydney. So perhaps you might like to respond, Mary.
Hi, Sally.
Oh, Mary, it's lovely to see you there. Good on you.
Yeah, look, I agree with what you're saying. It's one of those things, a lot of people don't want to address these issues because when anyone talks about Aboriginal matters, they're like, oh, it's a topic that we don't want to discuss, or it's really touchy, it's a tough subject. But it's clear that Aboriginal women are dying at the hands of their partners. And I don't understand why politicians and people are not speaking up about this when it's clearly happening all the time. And like you said...
So do you have an answer for that, Mary, as to why you think this has become such a hidden problem?
I think it's around people. I think it's layered. It's very heavily layered. It's almost like you've got many groups, put it this way, you've got many groups where people think that talking about Aboriginal issues will cause more problems, when really you're causing more problems by not addressing the issues. It's not saying, hey, Aboriginal people are really bad people. I think all cultures are going to have the issues. It's about addressing why and what's happening in this cultural group with Aboriginal people. And if we want to be supportive of Aboriginal rights and whatnot, I think we need to go down to the core of what's happening with Australia and why aren't we talking about it? Like, I think people are just...
We're on the same page, Mary. We're absolutely on the same page.
So I'm really happy that you're actually talking about this issue because it's something that doesn't get discussed, and people don't want to discuss it because it is such a really touchy subject, and I think we should talk about it, and I think it should be something. If you want to be, if people want to be pro-Aboriginal, if we want to do the right thing by our First Nations or Indigenous Australians, then this is something we're going to talk about. It is domestic violence. It is one of the biggest killers for Aboriginal women.
Yes, I agree. And, I mean, it's great that you actually come from the NT and you will have an empathy with what I'm saying and an understanding, because often it's very difficult for people that come from other places in Australia or who haven't lived in the bush a bit or whatever, and they just don't, they have no connection with it, whereas here you see it every day.
Yeah, and you raised a subject I think people don't understand around Aboriginal people living in this area, and they're so confined by their cultural obligations. Basically, if you do report something, there is going to be payback, what they say, payback, or you get repercussions, or something happens to your relative, or so they try and burn down your house, they try and hurt you, whatever they do, there's always repercussions. And I think people have got to realise that culturally they do this and it shouldn't be accepted. People need to turn around and say, hey, you can't be doing that because you're harming women and children. Full stop. It's not allowed. You can't do it. And there should be a stance on that.
Well, I think we're in heated agreement, Mary, and it's really terrific because, you know, as you know, as a white woman calling it out, you know, it doesn't, you know, it's very, very easy to put people down. But I just think that it is so serious that I would be remiss if I did not call it out. And I'm very, very grateful to CEDAW to have this opportunity to put it to you. I mean, all the evidence is before you, and it can't be that hard to get that evidence from the Department of Health. And I think that will be even more horrifying than the jail statistics.
Yeah.
That we have to find a way to protect Aboriginal women, because at the moment they've got nothing. They're prisoners. They're just prisoners on these communities. They can't leave. I mean, I had a case, you know, I left the bar in 2010, but I had a case where I was acting for the grandparents of a community, and what had happened was they were very respectable Aboriginal people. The grandfather was a senior elder, not a drinker. The grandmother was head of the primary school, so they were, you know, sort of great people to, you know, represent. There was no credibility issues or whatever. We were making an application for the grandchildren, and what had happened was their son had bashed the mother quite significantly, and she had left and gone to live on the outskirts of Cannon with these children. Now, the issue, of course, was that my clients were saying, look, we want these children to grow up on country so they will know their culture, and they will be able to go through ceremony and all the rest of it and not be denied that culture. Now, the difficulty with that was I got up at first instance, but I lost on appeal, and probably quite rightly so, because what the judges said to me, well, where were your clients, Ms. Gearin, when this woman was being bashed?
Yeah.
But, of course, the big losers are the children.
That's right.
They either lose their mother or they lose their culture. They should not have to make those decisions. No child in Australia should have to make those decisions. And I've referred to the criteria in the Family Law Act, where being brought up on culture, and I mean, that case is, you know, like probably 2008 or 7 or something. I mean, I can find a reference to it and send it down to you if it would be of assistance. But since then, there is probably more of a leaning towards culture being more important in relation to best interests of the children.
Yeah.
So that puts these women in an even worse situation. I mean, you know, you can't just remove them from where they are, their language, the whole 9 yards, and take them somewhere else. That's not fair to them. But then again, the other alternative is that they lose their mother, and their mother is not to blame for any of this.
But shouldn't they be removing the perpetrator?
Well, that's what I've said. That's what I've recommended. I think that perpetrators have to be removed out of communities. But then again, I mean, Mary, is it Mary Kerr? I'm sorry. Yeah, Mary, you know, as you would know, that creates its own problems, because, you know, if the perpetrator gets removed and you're the one who's told on him, well, your bloody house is going to get burnt down, or you're going to get bashed, or whatever. It's not simple. It's not. If there was a simple answer to it, somebody would have found it by now. But there are plenty of brains in that room down there, and I'm sure you'll be able to think it through and at least raise it, and maybe we can move forward with it, because I just think it's a horror.
Well, one of the concerns is, and I'll hand over to Helen and Kerry also in a moment, but in the CEDAW Committee is doing the Australian review. It's already in process, and it's going to be doing it next year. Now, one of the issues that's been raised, or that they're raising, is what steps Australia has taken to implement recommendations on Aboriginal customary law. And this raises an issue. Back in about 1986, Brian Keon Cohen was the commissioner at the Australian Law Reform Commission. They did a report on Aboriginal culture and how the legal system should value it, etc. But we also have to look at how it might impact negatively on women, as in this instance. And if I can just refer, there were 3 cases in the Northern Territory where, and I'm coming to the question, might we as non-Aboriginal lawyers be part of the problem? Not you, but generally. Yes, in these 3 cases, there were 2 judges. One judge sat on 2 cases, another judge sat on 1. And they were rape cases. And in each of them, it was an Indigenous Australian man who was the accused, the defendant. And what was brought by the Aboriginal Legal Service, and they were white, quote unquote, lawyers, was that what the court had to take into account was that Indigenous Australian culture privileged males conducting themselves in this way in regards to sexual matters and Indigenous Australian women. And those 2 judges said to these lawyers, hold on a moment, you're speaking from the point of view of these men. I want to hear from the women. And so those 2 judges were acutely aware that, you see, you can say this is culture, that's culture and so forth, but whose culture? Because we know in our culture, if somebody came from Mars, what would they think our culture is? They wouldn't think it's what we think it is as women. They'd think about it from the perspective of the masculine society, patriarchal society. That's what they think was our culture. And so that's what these judges were saying, that there may be an Indigenous Australian culture, but is it the culture that you are telling me that it is? And I think coming back to CEDAW, we have to be really careful that submissions like yours are incorporated to put to the CEDAW Committee to make sure that they don't go down this line of privileging one view of what culture is and ignoring the women's view of what culture is. But now I've said that.
As a very good anthropologist friend of mine said, culture evolves, it is not static. And that's what I say about this, and why I use the analogy with what was okay 100 years ago in our culture, in the way that women, our white culture, in the way that women were treated, is exactly what is happening for Aboriginal women now. Culture is not static, culture evolves. Aboriginal people don't just, they're not in a time warp. And another point I wanted to raise, I remember one of those cases, I think, was where the parents of a young girl, a 13-year-old girl, had sold her to an old man, supposedly a cultural arrangement that involved green cans, and she was kept prisoner and raped for 3 days. And that matter came on before the Supreme Court up here. And his sentence was reduced because of his culture. But I remember that case very, very well, because, you know, the evidence of what is culture when you don't have a language is very different. And of course, there are many tribes. It's not like there is one culture. Many people think different ways. So that's what I wanted to say in response to that.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, Helen, or yeah.
Can I want to speak from a position where I'm very sympathetic to you, but it might not sound that at first, so I just wanted to put that there. What troubles me is that one of the things that troubles me is that the violence is often imputed to what is called traditional. And as you say, you know, who knows what traditional means, but we sort of know what it means, but it's more complex than it appears. To traditional society, you know, that Aboriginal men were always violent to women. But there is another kind of, and that may be true too. I have no idea really. And I don't know how we would know that, because we, you know, the knowledge that we have is limited to past that. And what you might say is that what we're looking at now is something more like a culture in disarray rather than a culture. No, so it's a culture that has been, it just, when you were speaking, I was reminded of, my son is very fond of American blues songs. And one of the songs that he loves, and which I think is wonderful as well, is a song by Muddy Waters, I think, or somebody like that, Mississippi somebody. And it's called I'm a Man. Do you know that? And he's got a very deep voice, and I'm a man, M-A-N, man. And my son and I were discussing it on a road trip one day, and he was saying, you know, well, you have to understand, Mum, he said, that this is a person who has been demasculated, or we say emasculated, you know, who has been made to be, this was in the United States, made to be a boy. He was always called boy. You know, when you wanted to address him, that was how you called him. You didn't address him as a man, you didn't address him as a person. And so this was kind of his aggressive and very macho masculinity was a kind of reaction to being emasculated rather than a kind of feature of the culture. Well, it is a feature of the culture now, but you know, and elaborated in hip hop and all that sort of stuff. But it might sound like an academic kind of point, which of course I'm an academic, so I'd make the point, but you know, that there's another point there, which is that it does matter. It does matter whether we understand it as a traditional way of being with women, or if we understand it as, you know, a particular type of very toxic, and obviously more toxic to the women who are killed and are maimed and the children, but it's also toxic in a different way to the men. And it matters how we address it. And I don't know, I'm like you, I'm kind of, if there was, I always say that to students, look, if there was a simple answer here, we'd do it. Everybody would do it. And it is a complex thing, but it does make a difference whether how we understand it in terms of, you know, is it primarily a sign of a culture undermined and continually under threat?
Well, I think to be fair,
women pay the price. I know that.
In response to that is the argument that is put by Aboriginal legal aid in every case that goes to trial.
But there's something to it, isn't there?
Well, I don't know.
Oh.
Where's the evidence? I mean, I'm in the evidence business.
Yeah.
And as you say, you're an academic, and I don't disparage you in any way from that.
No.
But I'm saying that, you know, I think there are many ways to look at this, just like there were, you know, 50 or 100 years ago in our culture, when everybody said, oh, well, it's okay to hit women, you know, people do it, blokes do it. Not every man did it.
Most of them did. Oh, sorry.
Well, a lot did, but a lot didn't. And so I think what has to happen is that there has to be a cultural change, which is that Aboriginal men have to stand up and say it's not okay. And I've also referred to Charlie King's, you know, the No More, which is underfunded. It's now been, you know, the word Aboriginal male perpetrator's been taken away from all of it. But I mean, if you're looking for a solution, the change has to come from Aboriginal men, just like it had to come from white men. Because that's how culture changes.
Can you just very quickly, and I don't say very quickly disparagingly, just because we're running out of time, I think, what would that involve, a program for men? What would it be?
Sorry?
What would a program for men, what would be the shape of it, do you think?
Oh, I think that there is absolutely nothing in the jails now. And there should be perpetrators programs in all of the jails, right? So people have the opportunity. Can I tell you a classic example of what people tell me happens now? Is, I mean, even if you change 5 people, that's 5 blokes. That matters. But people tell me this. What happens is, you know, Johnny bashes Sally at wherever community. You know, she's very badly injured. He goes to jail for 3 years, right? He's in jail. He's off the grog. He's, you know, working in the jail doing something, and he's really looking forward to going home and all the rest of it and seeing his wife again. He gets off the plane at his country, and all his mates come over and say, oh, it's really good to see you again, mate, you know, come and have a few drinks. And then they say, oh, you know, your wife's been screwing, you know, Bluey, you know. And so he has another 400 beers and he then goes and bashes Bluey and then goes and bashes his wife again and then he goes back into jail. Therein lies the cycle. So in answer to your question, I think there should be perpetrators programs in jail and I think they should be run by Aboriginal men, not white men.
Yeah, because it's the men who are not in jail who should be taking the steps too, isn't it? Standing
Absolutely.
up, not meeting him at the plane and saying, come off for drinks, meeting him at the plane and giving him support so he doesn't go off for drinks.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Because that's still the case in non-Indigenous culture. What happens in non-Indigenous culture is that the men should stand up. In the pub, they should say, hold on, we don't speak like that about our wives, etc., etc. That's what should be said. Yeah. But
well, as I say, you know, we're all on the same page here and that.
We do. But really quickly, Kerry, did you have something you'd like to raise with Sally?
I worked at the Ethnic Affairs Commission for a period of time and much of the same argument was applied then and it was always excuses for the cultural behaviour of certain people. And there was a particular incident that occurred, this is way back in 1979, 80, about 1980. It was an incident occurred in the Northern Territory of a young girl, 12-year-old, had been given to, I thought yours was going to be the case I was talking about, wasn't, given to an elder and she didn't want to and she escaped. And she hid out in, I think, might have gone to Darwin or Alice Springs and hid out there. And it caused a lot of discussion in the community as to whether or not she should go back because that was her culture, or whether or not the prevailing feminist culture, which is what I adhered to, was that she needed protection. I can honestly tell you that the cultural one won out. And I was considered highly punitive, highly anti-male, because I wanted to protect, my view was to protect the child, the mother.
It's called shooting the messenger.
Yes, I know. But the issue is not about me. The issue was that all of the alternative culture, the Ethnic Affairs Commission and various others always go in to protect the culture as opposed to the person.
Yeah.
And you're right about the jails, but you also have to get in with those very same people questioning that culture.
Yes, exactly. You know, I think the other thing that I'll finish on, and it'll only take a second, is this. When that case came up, the one I spoke about, my granddaughter was in her early teens then, and I was horrified that if something like that had happened to her, she would have more rights as her mum's Maori, right? She would have more rights as a non-Aboriginal girl than that poor Aboriginal girl who was in that situation and kept kidnapped and raped and kept there for 3 days locked in a room. That's what fired me up about this argument about Aboriginal law, because no matter which way you look at Aboriginal law, it never favours women and girls.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Sally.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm very, very grateful to have the opportunity to present this very important matter to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Sally. The case, you were going to send us the reference to the case that you did.
I'll find it. It might take me a day or so. It's in the family court, but I'll send that down.
That's appreciated. So thank you so much, Sally Gearin.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.